Hello, I'm Adam, and welcome to the Iklim Selangor 2023. So we are joined today by Azad from constituency N40, Kota Anggerik, Shah. This initiative is by Gabungan Darurat Iklim Malaysia, supported by Gabungan Bertindak Malaysia. And this interview will consist of three parts. So the first question is, will you push for, table and vote in favor of the urgent enactment of the Selangor Climate Emergency Act?
Yes, I do support the fact that, we need a formalized response to the fact that we will be facing a climate emergency. I mean, we have to be ready for climate emergencies. I will need to, however, scrutinize the act in detail to be able to give a clear and confirmed answer on whether I will be supporting the act per se. So I suppose what I can say is this. I support it in principle, but in terms of the details, I will need to scrutinize it and see, of course, whether there are any parts that I do need to look at and support. Yeah.
The second question is, will you push for, table and vote in favor to institutionalize a just transition mechanism of the fossil fuel economy towards a low carbon society? And will you push for the increase of resources for enabling community resilience and climate adaptation and education?
Okay. Once again, I will say that in principle, I do support that we have to move to a less carbonized economy. All right. But we also need to recognize that we are an oil-produced nation. The trick is actually in balancing these two interests in such a manner that it does not impact the wider public too heavily, but while still making the commitment to move towards this direction. Now, of course, if one were to say that, yes, I support it, and then we do it tomorrow, that I think is quite unfeasible, unrealistic. We need to acknowledge that, yes, this is a country of people as well, while the environment is undoubtedly our home, It is very important to protect the environment. It's very important to initiate this change. But again, it must be something which is realistic. It has to take into account that, the current state that we are in and how we can improve our direction. Yeah, that is how I would respond to that question, yes.
And the third question is, will you push for, table and vote in favor of a Freedom of Information Act so the public can access information related to the environment and climate and all administrative and government matters not directly related to national security?
Yes, I do agree with that. In fact, I would even say that we need this Freedom of Information Act to apply as widely as possible, but of course, taking into account security matters. In fact, there was indeed a survey which was released quite some time back. I did respond to that survey and I did offer my views in that survey. But of course, since that survey, I've not seen any movement yet in support of this Freedom of Information Act. But yes, I definitely do support having such an act. We need to empower our citizens actually to be able to contribute more on the environmental agenda. Restricting this flow of information, we are actually denying citizens the power to move this agenda forward. When you talk about developments that happen around in Selangor, for example, you could talk about perhaps the degazettement of specific areas of, it used to be called Bukit Rakah, but I believe now it's under Taman Botani. I'm not sure whether they're still using the name Bukit Cahaya. It's been renamed multiple times, but yeah, this is one of the things that I think we should heavily look into to ensure that, our green lungs around in Selangor are well protected, they're well preserved. And I believe the way in doing so is by gazetting this land. Another thing that we also need to touch on is, of course, the waterways that go around in Selangor. We've had numerous water cuts due to pollution of water sources, etc. There's also mechanisms under the National Land Code to protect these land banks, which is waterfronts. We need to protect all this to ensure that the climate agenda is secure. It doesn't impact the wider public. And this, I believe, is a low commitment as compared to something which needs a lot more deliberation, like the Climate Emergency Act that you mentioned earlier.
Question number 5 is quite related to what you have just said. So the question is, will you defend and push for measures to ensure the protection of existing forest reserves in your state and to encourage the same in other states so that forests remain intact as a whole functioning ecosystems to ensure continual protection of Malaysia's rich biodiversity, water catchment areas, and our rights to a green environment?
I think my answer to that was partially answered before this. Yeah. So yes, I do support it. Yes. Yes, we definitely need to protect the biodiversity of our country. I mean, Malaysia is one of the most biodiverse nations in the world. We have even species which are really, really unique to Malaysia. Like I believe there's a particular snail which is only in the limestone mountains in Perak. So it's not just forests, actually. We need to look at all the areas, all the habitats where these unique living creatures, we need to protect all these animals. And the thing is, the great concern is that there may be species that we have not identified yet, but they may be unfortunately lost if we do not protect and preserve these habitats.
Question number 6 is, will you push for changes in law or table in parliament to bring back local council elections, and by when?
Okay, when we talk about local council elections, right, I must stress here that I understand it is fully within the ambit of parliament. And currently I'm contesting for a state seat. So that would only lead me to the state legislative assembly. If, let's say, I were to get a seat in the legislative assembly, my capacity and capability is quite limited. But I want to stress here that that is actually a route even at the state level. If you study the 2014 case where the Penang state government tried to bring about local council elections, it was challenged, and ultimately the federal court found that they did not proceed with the correct steps. That if you were to study that finding, or rather the reported judgment of the case, the presiding judge, I believe, did mention that they should have engaged with, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Majlis Pembangunan Negara, but I will have to double check on that. But there is a particular agency that they do need to engage with before they can actually push for local council elections. So that is that route. And I do support heading in that direction because we need local council elections to ensure that, firstly, the wider public knows who their local councillors are. That is crucial and important because you can't expect, and I don't know, perhaps constituency with maybe a 65 or 70,000 voters to respond to each and every particular local council work that needs to be done. Perhaps it's the maintenance of public infrastructure, clogged drains, etc. This delegation of power needs to happen. It needs to be distributed. So yes, recognition of your local councillor is extremely important. Another thing is local councillors themselves need to be motivated to actually do the work, because I'm not going to tar all the local councillors that we have here under the same brush. There are some who are motivated despite the fact that they are appointed to their position, but there needs to be a systemic sort of motivation for them to do the work. Right now, what happens is that when they are appointed, their boss is, well, the state of Selangor, i.e. the Menteri Besar. So long as they were to act in such a way that ensures their continued employment or appointment, they'll stay on there. But if you hold them accountable to the wider public, then they do have to act and they have to answer to the public if they're not doing their work. So these are the two reasons why we have to support it, and we have to do it as soon as possible. In terms of timeline, what I will voice out for is for us to proceed with that ad hoc sort of mode as set out in the 2014 judgment. But if in the event that that fails, I will look towards pushing for it in Parliament. Perhaps not through myself, perhaps through MUDA's, Member of Parliament, Syed Sadiq. So this is something that I will voice out for, and I will try to push for it.
Question 7 is, do you place your voters or constituents and their needs, rights, and aspirations over that of your political party and your conscience and morality?
What I will say is this. To be very frank and straightforward, I'm a political outsider. Before Parti MUDA, I've never joined a political party. I've always been a political observer. I've been watching how our nation's political climate has been since, I believe, about 2013 onwards. For me, I've always been more towards principles rather than the party. So when we talk about whether it's going to be a question of the constituents versus principles, I do have to take a bit of a pause to think about that. But I recognize that the role does require me to represent my constituency within the framework of the state of Selangor. There will have to be a fine balance there, but I will say that in terms of party versus the constituents, I will definitely prioritize the constituency.
So the last question of part 1 is, will you push for a Malaysian Harmony Act that promotes compassion, kindness, and accommodation for diversity of opinion, culture, personal choices, and inclusivity that enables freedom from fear of bullying, oppression, retaliation, persecution, and prosecution, and limits the citizens' choice to be and express themselves within the context of existing laws and existing cultural norms?
Let me perhaps answer this in a number of parts. First of all, I of course support freedom of speech, freedom of expression, free from prosecution, oppression, etc. But in terms of whether I would support such an act, I think this needs to be somewhat balanced, because whenever you talk about instituting some kind of law which limits a particular expression that may be against one, it needs to be very carefully balanced. I will have to say that I will need to scrutinize the actual bill in detail before I can say that, yes, I support it. And I'm also not too sure whether having such a law is indeed the way to go about it. But what I will say is this: as far as possible, we must ensure that speech and expression must not be subjected to prosecution, persecution, and oppression. So this is my take on it. It's a question, of course, on how it finally manifests as to whether I can actually express my support. I do not believe there is a current draft available because I believe the previous one was somewhat dropped. I don't see any recent attempt to push for a particular bill at the moment. But yes, I would like to study it before I support any such specific bill. Yes.
Okay, thank you for the response. So for the part two is more about your constituency. The first question is, what do you see as the main issues in the constituency that have to be dealt with?
Okay, that is actually a somewhat difficult question because Kota Anggerik is actually a huge area which includes a whole host of different issues. So like when you talk about Setia Alam area, one of the main concerns there is the fact that parts of the land is sinking. Some of the houses there have been affected by hairline cracks, perhaps some even structural cracks, which are of course quite serious. And unfortunately, large bulk of them have not been able, I believe, to pursue legal action. So that's one issue that's in that area. But when we talk about Section 13, for example, then we start looking at the flood issue. Because in Section 13, in 2021, there were the floods. I believe there were a few people who unfortunately they passed away due to being stuck in the underground parking in some of the condos at the area. So that is a core issue at that area. And then when you talk about Denai Alam, this area has fairly recently developed. So there is a wildlife concern there, the interaction between wildlife and the public. I think not too long ago, there was a news report of this massive python in the area. So this is, again, another concern that goes on there. The central area of Kota Anggerik itself, I believe that the main concern here would be perhaps, well, in terms of flooding, I would say it's quite limited, but in the long term, that may also be a concern because there is a question about local maintenance of the drainage systems, for example, and of course, all this playground equipment, because Kota Anggerik has been this sort of place where the state government has tried to push all these different agendas, initiatives. They had the Laman Seni in Section 2, Section 7, but there's a lack of maintenance culture. So this is one of the concerns here, like, how much money are we putting into all these one-off sort of projects, which sort of just die off and then they're not maintained, and then they become an eyesore later on. Laman Seni Section 2 just yesterday, it looks quite sad at the moment. The artwork, especially that in the corridors, in the alleyways, are not well maintained. The paint is peeling off. It's also not a particularly clean area. You have animal feces all over the area there. So we need to start looking into these sort of issues within the central Kota Anggerik area. So yeah, different areas, different issues. There is no cohesive one thing that binds all of them.
And for that, what is your vision for this constituency if you are elected as Adun?
As Adun, I think we first need to look at what we can do at the state level. When we talk about the constituency, I think we need to segregate that as a separate part. When we talk about the state, we need to look at how we can actually optimize the state as a whole. The first point that I want to touch on is easing business, because Selangor is, of course, the most profitable state in the whole of Malaysia. It is number one. But we need to see how we can elevate this, how we can push this further. And I think that one of the easiest ways in which we can do this is actually simplify it for businesses to apply for licenses, permits, reduce their administrative costs in dealing with the government. Like, for example, right, if let's say you were to want to open a business here in Selangor, you might need to apply for certain licenses, certain permits. The way in which you need to do so is you need to deal with the counter. So what does that mean? You need to send someone over to the office. You need someone to get an application in. So this leads to a lot of wasted hours. Right now, we're in the digital age, right? So why can't we do all this digitally? And that transition doesn't need a whole complete makeover of what we have, because there's already a few small steps that have been taken there. Like currently, if let's say you were to go to MDSA, for example, you take a number, they give you a form, you fill in the form, and then you need to take another number to deal with the payment. But if you look at it, all this can actually be done digitally. So you can actually download that form online. I'm saying that it's feasible, I'm not saying that that's what we have now, but it's feasible for you to be able to download that form online, fill it in, and then have it scanned, and then after that, arrange for payment. For example, so this cuts out about 3 to 5 hours of you waiting at the NDSA. You don't need to look for parking at that central area. You address the parking problem as well. So for me, this is one of the crucial things that we do need to look at, a movement towards a full digitalization of state government services. I think another thing that we need to look at is the traffic issue in Selangor. The congestion is quite crazy. I've done the drive myself from Klang, from Chalam to KL every day for about 8 to 9 years. So for me, it took about 1.5 hours to get into KL, another 1.5 hours to get back. So that's 3 hours of my life every day. I don't want to do the math, but that's a lot of hours that I could have spent doing something a lot more productive. Just imagine how much hours would be saved by all the people here in Selangor if, let's say, we have a valid work from home scheme. I'm not saying it's something that we need to deploy immediately. I'm saying that it can be something that can be done in phases. Perhaps we could initiate it at the government level amongst government staff. But we limit it to, of course, administrative level staff, perhaps each employee 1 day in a week. Like this is, for example, well, of course, this needs to be studied with how the state government works, with the idea that once the government pioneers this, the private industries will be able to adopt these systems. As also, I can understand how private companies are concerned about this as well, because they would be charting into uncharted waters. There's a question about how much legal exposure they would suffer if, let's say, their employees were to take on such a scheme, and what sort of legal challenges they may have, because the whole employment scenario becomes somewhat different when you move into a work from home sort of scheme. But I believe that if the government can lead the charge, establish precedent as a proper scheme for private companies to follow, it will eventually be adopted throughout Selangor, and we will see the gradual reduction of traffic on the roads. Another thing that needs to be addressed in respect of congestion is, of course, public transport. I think this is what everyone's talking about. But one of the big issues is that the way in which our development goes, there doesn't seem to be a proper master plan, including first and last mile connectivity. When I was working in KL, for me to get to my office in Montiara at the time, I would have to take the KTM to KL Central. From KL Central, I would then need to find some sort of feeder bus. Well, there actually isn't a direct route to Montiara, so it's either Grab or whatnot, There's also a question about how am I supposed to get to the KTM from where I sit. If I were to drive there, that means, there's a question about parking. Is there sufficient parking actually to meet the needs of all of Shah Alam? Let's say they were to take the KTM. Clearly, there isn't. If you've been to Section 19, you'll see that there clearly isn't enough parking. It's these kind of issues that need to be taken into consideration. Even if you were to take the monorail around KL, right, you'll be able to see that it doesn't fully link up with KL Central. You need to cross over the road, and with Malaysia's weather, it's hot. And if you're working in an office, you need to be dressed in office wear. And then when you walk out in the sun, you start sweating, and then you get into the office and it's cold, people fall sick. These things that actually make the whole idea of public transport somewhat hostile to the general office worker. So we need to make it less hostile, really. So these are, I think, perhaps a few Selangor initiatives that we need to look at. And then when we talk about the constituency in particular, Shah Alam in itself is characterized by the three universities it has: UiTM, Unicel, and MSU. In here, I would say there's also an issue about congestion and public transport, in the sense that if you were to look at the smart Selangor buses, two of the lines are focused on university students, particularly Unicel and UiTM. When we talk, of course, about the whole framework, all four do cover all the students in general. We need to actually look into decongestion, in particular for Section 7. Section 7 along the UiTM Shah Alam exit is heavily congested every day. There is a hospital nearby as well. There are commercial areas within the vicinity. So there is a constant jam in that area, and this really needs to be resolved. If you were to ask me, an immediate sort of solution that can be looked into is for this sort of light electric vehicles, because Shah Alam as a whole already has an extensive bicycle lane network. But there's going to be a question of the clash of these electric light vehicles against bicycles. So we need to look into perhaps setting a particular timing where it's exclusively for bicycles, cycling, exercise, and perhaps a particular time frame where these sort of electric light vehicles is accepted. This is perhaps something that can be looked into in dealing with congestion in that area. I believe I've touched into, the home maintenance culture. I believe the ultimate path to that is, of course, local council elections. As I've mentioned before, that motivation must be there. But in the interim, I suppose what can and must be done, or at least if I were to be voted into, this is what I personally lead the charge on. I would lead a charge on a 3-month cycle for town hall meetings to be had within the constituency, where the local councillors would need to be present together with state assemblymen to answer to the wider public if, let's say, there are issues that are not addressed. I think this is a direct way in which we can inject that sort of motivation.
Okay. Last part is called Replica Questions. The response can be just yes, no, or pass. The first question is about other role. Introduce systemic change in state and PBTs to improve the service delivery, people-centric, inclusive, and holistic, focus on institutional reforms and structural changes.
Yes, I do support such change, yes.
Second is about anti-corruption. Work actively to eliminate corrupt practices in state and local councils through prosecution, revamp of administration processes.
Yes, I will support anti-corruption measures.
The third is holistic whole society approach in managing Selangor, eliminate silo working culture.
Yes.
Yep.
We need to look at it holistically.
The fourth is about local council election, institutionalize public participation, increase local representation by reinstating local council election.
Yes.
The next one is unity, actively promote unity and harmony in communities, constituencies, towns and cities, eliminating negatives to race and religion.
Yes.
The sixth one is transparency. So transparency in state and PBT processes. Question
Yes.
the use of OSA for issues that has no threat to the nation.
Yes, definitely.
The next one is balanced development. Curbing overdevelopment. Development in line with an integrated master plan, which includes but not limited to carrying capacity for Selangor. Ensure the KLSP 2040 and the SSP 2035 are in sync, and follow the acts, especially for hillside and TOD development.
Yes.
And the next one is B40 housing. Prioritize the improvement of living quality in PPR and low-cost flats. And
Yes.
the ninth one is public transportation, first and last mile connectivity. Last one is about climate. Implement a Selangor Climate Emergency Act and Climate Change Select Committee.
Okay. I think I've answered on this previously. There needs to be a bit of scrutiny, but yes, I agree, committee. I'm not sure how I can specifically promote myself, but let's look about what can be done for the past 5 years. We've seen a lot of political strife, which has not helped the country as a whole. We've been through Langkah Sheraton, we've been through COVID, we've been through the floods, and what started to happen was that there was this semangat kita jaga kita, because we have somewhat collectively lost faith in the capacity of the government to reach out and help the wider public. So I'm a political outsider. I'm not one of those political fat cats who have traditionally worked their whole life in some kind of a traditional political party. So what I'm trying to bring is that I'm trying to bring back that kind of the faith that people would have in the government to actually look out for their welfare, to address these things. And I'm not saying that, hey, look at me, this is what I'm doing, I'm pushing for this. No, what I want is actually a systemic solution to this, so that once the systems are there, we are less concerned about the personal moral of our leaders, but we have faith that the system works. The system actually ensures that the wider public welfare is taken care of. I think once that system is in place, and it has to be one that is proactive. For example, when we talk about the floods, right? One of the big issues was we had all these different agencies, but they're all working in silos, that communication doesn't reach the wider public. Unfortunately, people lost lives, they lost their goods because of this kind of failings. So we need to look into how we need to solve this on a systemic level. We can't say that, look, this is the federal government's job, this is the state government's job. There needs to be a synthesis, there needs to be an integration, at least to a certain extent, to allow the system to work, so that there is a flow of information from the agency concerned right down to the very citizen who's going to be impacted. So this needs to happen. And this is how we are looking at it, at least we in MUDA. I can't speak for the other parties, but this is how we are looking at it. We're trying to look at how we can solve these problems. We step out from the whole framework of it, from the whole federal and state framework. We see the problem, we try to look at what kind of solution can be brought, and then only we bring us back into that sort of national and state framework. And then we say, hey, look, we need to integrate these different departments. We need to talk about how we can link this up to solve this particular problem. So that's the approach we're taking. That's why when we talk about issues, we talk about federal and state, regardless of the fact that this is a state election, because we need to look at how the system works as a whole to ensure that the public's welfare is taken care of. They are the stakeholders. That's our approach.
Thank you, Azad, for spending your time with us on the Iklim Selangor 2023. And we wish you the best for your campaign.
Thank you. Just a few final words. I'm candidate number 3 for Kota Anggerik. Please look out for me on the ballot paper. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.